Welcome to the Phoenix Project. For a long time, I asked myself the same question people often ask survivors. Why didn't you just leave? Sometimes it's asked with curiosity. Sometimes it's asked with frustration. And sometimes it's asked with judgment. On the surface, it sounds like a simple question. If something is dangerous, if someone is hurting you, why wouldn't you walk away? But the reality behind that question is far more complicated, because leaving isn't a single moment. It's a process. And when coercive control is involved, that process can take years. One of the first things people misunderstand about these situations is that they rarely begin with obvious abuse. They begin with connection, with attention, with validation. Someone sees you, understands you, reflects part of yourself back to you that you may not even fully see yet. And slowly, your trust begins to shift. You begin trusting their interpretation of your life more than your own. This is where trauma bonding begins, not with fear, but with attachment. I remember how confusing that attachment felt, because the person who was hurting me was also the person who made me feel seen. When things were good, they were very good, and those moments made it difficult to hold on to the reality of the harmful ones. Part of me knew something wasn't right, but another part of me kept hoping the good version of him would come back and stay. When someone alternates between affection and control, validation and criticism, your nervous system becomes conditioned to the cycle. The relief you feel when the tension lifts becomes powerful. Your brain begins associating that relief with the person causing the pain. And over time, your world gets smaller. Maybe you move away from friends. Maybe family relationships become strained. Maybe the person begins managing the money, the decisions, or where you go. Each individual change can feel small, explainable, temporary, but together they create dependency. Another piece people don't often understand is how survival thinking works. When your nervous system believes you're in danger, your brain stops focusing on long-term freedom. It focuses on immediate safety. You begin making decisions based on what will keep the situation calm today, not what will change your life next year. Compliance can begin to feel like the safest option. Looking back, I can see how many decisions I made were about keeping the situation calm, not about freedom, not about long-term safety, just about getting through the day without escalation. When you live in that kind of environment long enough, your definition of success changes. Success becomes making it through the day without conflict, without anger, without consequences. Not because you agree, but because resisting feels risky. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like calculation. You weigh every decision, every word, every reaction, trying to prevent escalation. And shame becomes another powerful trap. For me, there were moments when the only thing that felt steady was my dog, Athena. She didn't understand the dynamics. She didn't know the psychology, but animals have a way of sensing when something isn't right. There were times when I would look at her and feel this quiet pull back toward reality, like some part of my life still existed outside of the chaos. Sometimes those small anchors are what keep a person connected to themselves long enough for the shift to begin. Many survivors ask themselves, how did I let this happen? How did I get this far into something that I can't easily leave? That shame can keep people silent because asking for help would mean explaining the situation, explaining the choices, explaining something that feels difficult to even understand yourself. But what's important to understand is this. These dynamics are psychological. They reshape how a person sees themselves, their options, and their safety. Leaving often doesn't happen when someone outside believes it should. It happens when something inside shifts. For me, part of that shift came when I began thinking about my daughters, not in a dramatic moment, but in quiet ones. Moments where I started asking myself, what would I want them to do if they ever found themselves in a relationship that felt like this? I realized the advice I would give them was very different from the compassion I was giving myself. And that realization was uncomfortable, but it was also clarifying. Because I wanted them to grow up believing that their safety mattered, that their voice mattered. And eventually I had to ask myself why those same things shouldn't matter for me. For me, that shift didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, through small moments where something inside me began to question the reality I had accepted. Moments where the story I had been telling myself no longer felt believable. Moments where the whisper became harder to ignore. And those moments eventually led me back to myself. Sometimes that shift comes from exhaustion. Sometimes it comes from a moment of clarity. And sometimes it comes from a quiet whisper that says, this isn't right. Leaving is rarely dramatic. It's often messy, complicated, and deeply emotional. It can mean rebuilding finances, rebuilding identity, rebuilding relationships, and sometimes, most importantly, rebuilding trust in yourself. For many survivors, the hardest part isn't leaving the person. It's learning to trust their own judgment again. Because coercive control doesn't just control your environment, it slowly erodes your confidence in your own perceptions. And rebuilding that trust takes time. If you've ever asked yourself, why didn't I leave sooner? I want you to hear this clearly. Survival decisions made in unsafe environments are not failures. They are evidence that your mind was trying to keep you alive. Understanding these dynamics isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing patterns so that survivors can find compassion for themselves and so that others can learn to recognize coercive control earlier. When I look back now, I don't see weakness in the time it took me to leave. I see someone navigating a situation that slowly reshaped her understanding of safety. And the most important part of healing has been learning to replace judgment with understanding. Awareness is where change begins. And when we begin to understand how these dynamics work, we become better equipped to interrupt them. Sometimes when people ask, why didn't you leave? What they're really asking is, what would I have done? And I understand that question because for a long time I asked it too. But the truth is, we don't really know how we'll respond inside a psychological environment like that until we experience it ourselves. Coercive control doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, in ways that reshape your thinking before you even realize it. And that's why conversations like this matter. Not so we can judge survivors for the time it took them to leave, but so we can recognize these patterns earlier in ourselves, in the people we love, and in the systems around us. Because understanding coercive control isn't just about looking back. It's about helping someone else recognize the whisper sooner. And sometimes that understanding can be the difference between someone staying silent and someone realizing they're not alone. That's where healing begins. And that's where we continue turning pain into purpose. If you are in crisis or need immediate support in the United States, you can call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you believe you may be experiencing coercion or trafficking, You can contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888, or you can text help or info to 233-733. If you'd like to connect, collaborate, or share feedback, you can reach me at phoenixprojectvoices@gmail.com. Please note, I am not able to provide one-on-one counseling or crisis support. However, I do truly appreciate the connection and the feedback. Thank you. This is the Phoenix Project.